Support this podcast at patreon.com/Kris Karl Photography Podcast. Start these is to find out how it is that you first picked up a camera, what your reason was for getting into photography in the first place. So how old were you and what was your reason for starting with photography?
Probably about 16 years old. And in the late 90s, in my high school, I was somehow allowed to take more than one art course each semester for my last 2 years I was in school. And so I did a lot of visual art, like painting, drawing, stuff like that. And we didn't have a darkroom or photography class at my school, but I was able to use photography and take pictures and use that within the work I was making in the class. And so I found a job with Eckerd's, a drugstore in the States, and got a job in the 1 hour lab, and basically just started developing my own film at work and printing stuff at work. And the 1 hour lab was a really, fascinating introduction to photography, and just kind of went from there.
You started off working with film?
I did, yeah. So I primarily shot film, really did not own a digital camera until fairly recently.
And do you see much of a difference in the way that you shoot with digital compared to film?
Yes and no. I don't get too particular about one versus the other. Basically, so I guess a little bit more about my background is I shot film from about, I would say, 1998 to about 2007. And then, photography was something that was really important to me. I did a lot of, and for whatever reason, around 2007, I just completely stopped. And I kind of had a 10-year gap. And it was around the time my wife and I were starting to, think about having a kid and stuff like that, that I really regretted this 10-year long gap that I'd had where I was not shooting at all, wasn't doing anything. And at that point, so this is about 2017, I decided I wanted to get a camera. Actually, take a step back. I decided I want to start shooting film again, and I loaded some film into my old camera, and the latch on the back door just broke. I was really frustrated. I called Canon. They don't make it anymore. They don't support. They don't have the replacement part for it. And so at that point, I was like, well, I'm going to get a digital camera, and went to my camera store. Talked with one of the guys there, and they talked me into getting a Fuji X-E2S. And I think the E3 had just come out, so I got a good deal on that, and then started shooting digital from there, and really enjoyed it. And for a few years, I started to build up a Fuji kit, got an X-T3. Got several lenses, and then just recently started shooting film again. I think it was actually right around the time the lockdown happened in Texas is when I started shooting film again.
And what was it that made you go back to film?
I have a good friend who is primarily a painter, and he does portraits, and he, shoots all of his models. And he had started getting into film, and, just him and I talking about it, and him asking me questions because he knew that I kind of had some background in it, really just, made me miss it, made me, want to start playing with it again. And so pretty much for the duration of the lockdown, I've just been shooting pretty consistently with film and really enjoying getting back into it.
And so you obviously talked about kind of a sentimental reason for picking up camera again, a personal reason in that sense, but how quickly were you back to photographing in an artistic sense as opposed to just for family?
It's hard for me to think about my work in that sense. I think I take a lot of pictures of things that are personally important to me and that I find interesting. And, my primary form of sharing those is via Instagram and stuff like that. but it's not something I take too seriously. It's something where it's just kind of a visual diary where, photos of my kids and photos of a building I walk past, I don't expect them to be of interest to someone else in the way that they're important to me or sentimental to me, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, do you feel like for someone to be kind of prolific, I guess, as an artist, they have to have a personal interest in what they're photographing anyway?
No, not necessarily.
No?
No, I don't know. I don't think that that's a prerequisite in my mind for achieving that.
One thing I've noticed with your work is there seems to be at least elements of it that are very focused on kind of the history of what you're photographing. How important is kind of the history of the places that you photograph as opposed to just the visual importance?
I mean, I almost think the history might have a little bit more importance to me. I think that that's what makes these subjects attractive to me, and what draws me to them. I used to, before I had a camera and I just had an Instagram feed where it was just phone pictures, it would just be dormant for months on end. And it wasn't until I was doing some sort of traveling or visiting someplace new that I would post pictures. And I feel like lately, and I think the lockdown probably has something to do with this, is that I've really started to see a lot more interest in what's immediately around me. I would say in the last 3 months, 90% of what I've been posting to there is within a 1 mile radius of my house. And it's just, going on walks with my kid, with my camera. I'll stop at any historical plaque anytime I see one and read it. I like finding those things, and those are meaningful to me, and I share them. And I hope that, people who see them take the time to look at the history of it, because that's what I think draws me to it. That's what makes me think it's worth taking a picture of.
Well, something I don't think people maybe completely get their head around outside of the United States is just the sheer size of Texas. And obviously there's a pretty vast difference between even sort of two of the major cities in Texas, somewhere like Houston and Dallas. There are obviously big differences there. But overall, what's Texas like as a subject?
It's, I think, a really interesting and fascinating subject. Texas is just littered with all of these small towns that are very much kind of frozen in time, that aren't going to change anytime in the near future. And there's, beautiful architecture. There's beautiful landscapes. And then Texas also has all these cities that have, really, really beautiful buildings, beautiful places to take photos that are changing so rapidly that I feel like a lot of what motivates my photos is that some of these buildings, some of these houses aren't going to be around in a year, in 5 years. And so, I think that's what compels me to make that type of work, is kind of documenting it.
I mean, you had something of a long hiatus where most people probably don't return to something if they haven't been using it or working within it for 10 years. It's a long time to go 9 or 10 years without touching something, and then to go back to it is pretty rare. Did you feel like when you came back to photography, it felt familiar, or were you kind of a new photographer from then?
It's really a mix of both. And I think that's what's made revisiting it so interesting and so much fun and so exciting, is that there is a familiarity where I understand key concepts. I understand the basics. But revisiting it, as someone in their mid 30s versus someone in their mid 20s, I never stopped viewing other people's work. I never stopped appreciating photography. And I think it's given me a lot of time to just be a little slower with it, be a less compulsive shooter, if that makes sense.
And one thing I always find fascinating with photographers, especially because I'm very people-centric with the work that I do, I always find people, when photographers aren't photographing people, I'm fascinated with how they decide on a composition and where they kind of build out from. So when you're out with your camera and you see an image, what is it that's grabbing you first? Is it like the color, the light, sort of just the historical context, I guess, or the geometry? What's the first thing that usually grabs you?
I would say, because most of my work is just buildings. I would say it's the building in and of itself. And a lot of times, especially because what I'm photographing is within a mile of my house, I do a lot of scouting where, I'll take note of a particular building or a particular scene. And I'll kind of notice that, it's not the right type of day or maybe not the right time of year to take a photograph of it. I might snap something just quickly as a reference. But a lot of my walks and, wandering around my neighborhood is, scouting and taking notes of, hey, I need to come back here in the morning. I need to come back here in the evening. I need to come back here midday. And trying to work out the composition from there. I think that the way things lie within the frame is a lot less important to me than what the light is doing. And so I've become a lot more aware of that, I think. And that's something I didn't do when I was a younger photographer. It was just whatever was in front of me. I took a picture when I was there. And I think that might be kind of the slowing down and not feeling, as compulsive with taking pictures, is really waiting for when it's right.
I mean, you mentioned as well about, or at least I get the impression you're not particularly fussed about outside opinions when it comes to your work. You're shooting what is important to you and what's interesting to you. In that sense, I think a lot of the younger generation are going to struggle to kind of get their head around that concept, because a lot of what any kind of art form is these days is about validation from other people. Like everything seems to be as a means to an end, a way of creating likes or followers or generating numbers that kind of validate your existence as an artist. What is it that keeps you photographing? What does it do for you?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And I think that it's sometimes what drives people to generate work that, I don't know, maybe in 5 years when they look back at it, they're not going to be happy with. But, the feedback loop that is Instagram, I find it's interesting. I'll post something that I don't particularly feel attached to, and it'll be, very popular. And then I'll post something, the next day that I absolutely love. And I just think is so good and I'm so proud of, and it won't be popular. And that doesn't bother me. It's not something that affects me. I think that at the age I'm at and where I'm at with creating work, I'm comfortable enough to not need that feedback loop to confirm or to affirm that, what I'm doing is good. I think that, if everyone disappeared tomorrow from Instagram, I would still be doing the same thing, still be taking the same photos. I find Instagram more interesting for the community aspect of it. I feel like the number of messages that I've sent to other photographers or that other photographers have sent to me, asking questions, that is what's more appealing to me, is the real interactions that I'm having with people via that platform rather than just, likes or follows.
I mean, but beyond the obvious convenience of that being on a phone, what is it, do you think, that's holding back a photographic community being that positive away from social media? Like camera clubs, I don't know so much about America, but camera clubs in England are generally completely turgid affairs that are full of very, 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 very old people that are absolutely convinced that no one else can ever teach them anything. And they almost seem to go out of their way to prevent, inclusion in terms of age and gender and so on. Just wondering what it is that the photographic community in person seems to be so different from the photographic community on somewhere like Instagram.
Yeah, I mean, what you're describing is similar to a lot of the scenes I've interacted with in Texas, where there is kind of this wall of experience and knowledge, and it hasn't been as welcoming as I think it really could be. And that's something that I think is really lacking. Is I've made a point recently to try to seek out more Texas-based photographers, and I'd really like to start to have more, once we're able to, in-person interactions with other creatives and other people who are doing interesting work. Because I feel like, as nice as Instagram is, and it's so cool that I can see people from all over the world, all different ages, and see what they're doing, what they're creating, that in-person element I do think is lacking. And I think that it's something that I wish existed, at least in my community, a little more.
If it started to turn the corner a little bit and talk about cameras for a second. Just wondering, obviously you've mentioned shooting with Fuji for your digital stuff and your film stuff as a separate thing. How much does the sort of personality, I guess, of the camera dictate the way that you're shooting?
I don't know if the personality of the camera dictates how I shoot, but I'm definitely drawn to particular cameras. I think the salesperson that talked me into Fuji when I described kind of my history and where I'm coming from, made a good call and gave a good recommendation. I've been really, really happy with the XT3. I went crazy with buying lenses for it. I love working with that camera because it does have this nice tactile interface that is very familiar to someone coming from film into digital. That doesn't feel the same when I've, borrowed other people's, digital cameras. I'm really enjoying 35 millimeter and 6x4.5 right now. And that's been kind of what I'm playing with. I think the way it changes is that when I'm walking around with a digital camera that has a huge memory card in it, I just kind of shoot at will. The thing I talked about earlier where it's kind of camping and really waiting for the right time, I think film has kind of introduced that concept to me a little bit more in a real way, where, there might be a composition or a scene that's not worth taking when the light's not right, that it's not worth wasting that physical medium when I know that I could come back at a different time on a different day and capture it better. So I do appreciate how film slows me down.
But with something where you've got, obviously, like you mentioned, with a huge memory card in the Fuji, you can kind of shoot ad nauseum. Do you feel like that's a great time to experiment? Because one of the things with film photography is obviously with the cost involved and the restrictive number of shots, you've got to be relatively safe, I guess, in the way that you're photographing stuff. So are you using digital as kind of the sort of the testing for the stuff that you would then shoot on film?
Yeah, totally. One thing that I think that I really utilize the digital cameras for is, I'm interested in learning more about how to take interesting photos at night that aren't just like those street scenes with like Cinestill. Like, we took a trip out to the desert and we're in a ghost town, and I had a blast just spending like 3 hours with my digital camera doing these long exposures and seeing what came of it. And I feel like that's not something that I am skilled enough to do with film, or, brave enough to waste that money on film at the moment. And another thing I think I use it for is I'd really like to start taking more photos of people. I think that that's one of my big weaknesses and something I've always been interested in. And so I've been kind of playing around with studio flashes and stuff like that. And that's another thing that eventually I would love to be able to do with film. But right now, digital is a great way to experiment because you do get that instant feedback where you're able to see, what's working, what's not working. And so I'm using digital to kind of hone those skills.
What about photographing people do you feel you have a weakness with?
That I don't feel comfortable doing it. Whether that be in a, formal portrait setting, whether it be in street photography, whether it just be casual things with friends. I feel very self-aware that I'm inconveniencing someone by taking their photo, which I think is a weird hang up to have. I think it's something that I definitely need to get over, because I think that a lot of people aren't as inconvenienced as I think they are by having their photo taken. But yeah, just kind of working on that and learning more about doing portraiture is, I think, what I want to focus on next. And I kind of made that decision, several months ago. It became very inconvenient to see people. So it's kind of put that on the back burner for now.
One thing that's been hard for me to get my head around, especially moving outside of photographing just people, is how narrative can be an important part of composition when there's no people involved. Because I always feel like story and narrative in any kind of visual art has to involve people. And I think I've been completely wrong about that for a while. Do you think that it's sort of inputting some kind of narrative is an important part of composition, or is it something you're not particularly fussed by?
Yes and no. I mean, it's something that I think that when I look back at what I'm producing and what I'm taking photos of and how I'm approaching these subjects, I think that narrative does play an effect on it. It does come into play. it's not something that I spend a lot of time thinking about beforehand. But it is something that when I'm looking, after I develop a roll or two, I look and I see that there is a narrative coming through with the work I'm creating. I found that especially true. I've been, going to some of the protests that have been happening near my house, and the photographs I've been taking there and the conversations I've been having with people there have been interesting and definitely have a narrative to them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of led me down one aspect I really wanted to talk to you about, which is I want to ask kind of a broad question. So it's a sort of specific question, but it's kind of broadly aimed at all photography, not one particular genre. But what do you feel like the social responsibility of a photographer actually is?
It's a really good question. And I don't know if there's an easy answer to that. I think that I personally try to make work that feels truthful. I feel like my interaction with photography is to show things that I've seen from my point of view while still remaining truthful. And I think that, that's kind of the ethics that I adhere to when I'm creating something. But I don't know if I can make like some sort of definitive statement on what the responsibility is in general for all photographers. Because I think that photography does involve a lot of sleight of hand and a lot of, what are you cropping out? What are you editing out? What are you choosing to photograph? So there's never a true truthfulness to it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you can't help your own bias in the sense of even down to just your subconscious choice in direction that you walk. So if you go to something that's happening in the center of a city or a town, and you choose to go, down this street instead of that street, you end up being a kind of unconsciously biased in the sense that you've just chosen to go in a direction that you might not be able to even validate the reason why you did it, but it's led you to get the photos that you've got. And I think with something like the protests at the moment, something that seems to be an overriding theme is what you said at the end there, not so much like in the editing sense, but in what's being chosen to be photographed and not be photographed. And I feel like there's a big disconnect with pretty much everybody right now. And, obviously you don't want to go down the route of making this a political podcast by any stretch, but I do feel like there's a responsibility to an extent to photograph the best and worst of whatever you agree with. And that applies to anybody on any extreme end or anybody in the middle. I just feel like there's a responsibility that if you want to consider yourself and you want to be considered a documentarian, or you want to be considered someone that is bringing attention to something, you have to be willing to show exactly what's there, not cherry pick stuff that suits one narrative or the other. And I feel like it just seems like everybody is, and obviously everybody's an incredibly stupid term to use at this point, but everybody seems to be cherry picking. And I think that leads to a lot of the problems that we actually have in general. With regards to the editing side of things, do you feel like this is kind of something that I've been mulling over for a while now, but do you feel like there's more of an honesty or a perceived honesty to film photography as opposed to digital? Because digital has basically the inbuilt stereotype of Photoshop.
Not really. Just because I've seen, so many film photographers, there's this obsession, I think, with not editing, which doesn't make sense to me coming from a place where, I started in a dark room. Like my photography was in a dark room, and there are things you do in a dark room that are editing. And so this idea that everything's straight out of camera is more pure, I don't get, because there are adjustments you're making within Lightroom or Photoshop or whatever you're using that are essentially the same type of things that you would be doing within a dark room when you're processing images. So I do think there's a little bit of an obsession with this purity of, I only post things straight out of camera, and I'm not a fan of over editing. I don't like images that have been, where you're messing with the colors in a crazy way, where you're, removing things, where you're masking things out in a crazy way. But, I don't approach film or digital very differently when it comes to how I process my images. I do really wish that I could get access to a darkroom. That's something I dearly miss with when it comes to film, is that when I'm shooting film now, it's shoot a roll, get it developed, get scans from the lab, and then it just feels like digital at that point. Where I want to be, printing my images, and not from, a Canon printer. I want to be printing them on photo paper in a darkroom. So that's something that I've been really missing, coming back to it after taking a long break.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's not something I really want to challenge you on, because obviously that's completely valid the way that you put that, but you're obviously coming from a point of view of experience as a photographer. And I feel like maybe from an outside perspective of people that just know film being something that's a physical, tactile thing, and a digital image being something that is getting close at this point, especially maybe because I'm from a different world with it a little bit, with working in portraits and fashion and whatnot. But at points, it feels like photography is getting closer to graphic design than it is photography, in the sense of, like you say, the crazy colors and the over editing. Do you feel like that issue of the sort of the perceived honesty of film is something that could be understandable from like a general member of the public as opposed to an actual photographer?
I mean, I feel like when I have conversations with people who are completely outside it, the question I hear more than or the statement I hear more than there's honesty inherent within film is just like, why are you shooting that? Like, why are you spending this money to work in this? I feel like general public just doesn't understand why people want to work in that medium. But yeah, I can see the general idea that there is, less editing involved with film, that your film stock dictates a lot of what the image is going to be. You don't get to choose your ISO midway through the roll. You've chosen a film stock, you've chosen black and white, you've chosen color, you've chosen something that works really well with warm tone, something that doesn't, and you're committed to that. Whereas, you walk out with your digital camera, you're just shooting raw, you don't box yourself in, you don't give yourself those constraints. So I think in that sense that there is a little bit more of a purity to film, but I don't get too caught up on it. It's not something that I think is as important, at least in my approach to how I use both mediums.
Well, let's create a little bit of a link for you here, so that you can, when you do get asked that inevitable question by people that don't understand why you shoot film, let me ask the question, and then you can just point them in the direction of a small soundbite, and that can do the work for you. So obviously you've mentioned coming back to photography with digital. Why do you still shoot film?
I think I like the experience, and I think that this is common to a lot of people who enjoy it. The delayed gratification, it makes the experience of going out and shooting so much more pleasant, because you're thinking about your composure, or composition, you're thinking about the lighting, you're thinking about all this. And after you take the image, you don't get to turn to the back of your camera and zoom in as close as you can and double check that you got something right and then recompose it. The actual process of doing it is a little bit more pleasant for me. And I enjoy it more. And that's when I'm shooting things that I'm, familiar with. I do a lot of just, shooting in broad daylight using Sunny 16 and not thinking too much about settings, just going off that. Whereas I think digital, like I said earlier, is super handy when you do need to double check images, when you do need to, look at the back of the camera and make sure that what you're doing is working. They both have their place for me, but I definitely find the process of making film photographs more pleasant.
Do you feel like, and this is a bit of a loaded question, so I do apologize, but do you feel like shooting film is something that a photographer should do generally? And do you think it's something that a photographer should do to become a real photographer?
That's another one where I feel kind of yes and no. I feel like you don't need to be a real photographer. You don't need to shoot film to be a real photographer. Period. I think that if you're making images, you are a photographer. If the work you're making is important to you, you're a photographer. I think the experience is helpful. I think that, especially because I shot film, stopped for a long period of time, shot digital, came back to film and continue to shoot digital, it makes me approach my digital photography in a more thoughtful way. I do less of the bad habits that I was describing earlier, that, chimping all the time, looking at the back of your camera. I've started to become more comfortable just using intuition and trust in what I'm doing instead of obsessing over it while I'm doing it. So I think it's helpful. I think that, if you have the opportunity, if you are able to, I don't think there's any reason not to shoot film at some point. I think you're going to learn a little bit more, but I don't think you need to shoot film to be a real photographer by any means.
Why do you think it's come back in such a strong way? Obviously, with YouTube and Instagram and stuff, they seem to be big catalysts, but film photography's made a real go of it as a comeback in the last few years. What do you think the reason is behind it?
I mean, it's so many things. I think that there's a lot of really talented people creating content for YouTube that's inspiring people to shoot. I think that those videos have exposed this medium to people who might not have had experience with it earlier in their life. And also, like me, made them kind of want to revisit it. So I think that those people creating those videos do a lot to drive interest in it. And then I think it's just like the general nostalgia that people have for things, with vinyl records, with owning physical books, like with, all of these things where there's something tangible, there's something, nostalgic about it, essentially. I think that there's an appeal to that. I think that, my personality is drawn to that type of thing by nature. And I totally understand why others would be as well.
With your photography in particular, do you feel like your style is changing over time? Are you gravitating more in a direction you didn't think you'd go into? And where you are now as a photographer, is it where you were kind of aiming to head for at the beginning?
I feel like my style has stayed pretty consistent. I think that, when I was in high school and then early years of college, I was taking pictures of old buildings. I was taking pictures. I was breaking into abandoned factories. I was doing that. I had professors that introduced me to people like William Christenberry and William Eggleston. And those have always kind of been what I've been drawn to and interested in, kind of the seeing beauty in mundane things. That being said, I don't think that that's where I want my endpoint to be. I think that I do really want to work on doing more photos with people. Environmental portraiture is something that I've been fascinating with. I think people like Alex Soth, his work is really inspiring to me. Sally Mann's work is really inspiring to me. And I would love to kind of work towards getting there. I feel like I haven't gotten to where I want to be when it comes to my relationship with my photography.
Not to draw anything too controversial out of you, but if you could change anything about the sort of the general photographic community to make it a better place, a more productive place, a happier place, what would you change about the community in general?
I mean, I think if you spend any time in some of the photography Facebook groups, you'll see this. And there's just a lot of negativity and a lot of gatekeeping and just a general snobbery about it, which I think is really off-putting to people who, are just starting to get into it. I would really like to see less of that. I think that that's something that is unnecessary and unproductive and, turns people off to something that, could be really, really good or interesting to them.
And if you were to evaluate yourself, which I always say is probably the hardest thing to do, because people tend to go either very positive or very negative about themselves. How do you see your work? What do you see your biggest weakness being?
I mean, I think it's that I don't have a very diverse portfolio. And I think that working with people is something that is next for me. And it's going to be a whole new learning curve. Because even when I was photographing, 20 years ago, I didn't do a lot of work with people. Outside from shooting punk shows, it was mostly just, stagnant objects. So, I'm happy with the images I'm creating. I like them. But I think that I have a long way to go before I'm going to feel that I'm confident and comfortable with who I am as a photographer.
Well, this push to be better at photographing people, does this come down to sort of a desire for more photographic dexterity, or is this something where you actually have an interest in photographing people being sort of a main aspect of what you do?
It's more of having an interest in photographing people. And I feel like, most major cities have a Facebook group where it's a model photographer Facebook group where you can get connected with models who want to be photographed. And, that's not necessarily what I'm interested in doing. I'm more interested in taking photos of people that are not models and people that have more interesting stories or histories or environments. And so kind of figuring out how to build those relationships, make those connections, have the trust with those people where I'm able to, get into their spaces and photograph is what I'm more interested in. And that's, I think, why I have not done it, because it doesn't seem as easy as just, going to one of those Facebook groups and connecting with someone who wants their picture taken. So that's kind of, what I see on the horizon for me. But it definitely is motivated by wanting to take pictures of people who are interesting and people who have stories to tell, people who have, spaces they've created, and I want to take pictures of them in those spaces. And I think it goes a lot to my photos of old buildings, my photos of historic places. That's what excites me about photography, is getting these things, these pictures made of things that aren't going to last, the things that, should be documented, should be recorded. So that's kind of how I see that.
Well, with your interest in history, and obviously I'm talking to you all the way from England, and we have a little bit more history at this end of the world by definition, I guess. Are you interested in visiting other destinations around the world with the view of kind of documenting the history of those places?
I am. I feel like, I'm not a very well-traveled person. I've left the US exactly twice, once when I was 14 and once on my honeymoon. So, I feel like I've not gotten to experience enough other places. And I definitely, once we can move around again, would love to try to make that a priority as well. Because I find, I love Texas history. I love, this neighborhood I live in, the city I live in, the state I live in, for some reasons, not others. But yeah, I would really like to be able to travel more and photograph more in other places, kind of with that same mentality.
Well, I definitely get the impression from your work that somewhere like older or more rural Germany and sort of southern France would definitely be somewhere that your work would really suit to. Is there anywhere in particular that you'd really like to travel to?
Not that I can think of right now. I feel like, I love trying to visit a national park each year in the US. Those are always destinations. I love all the little towns that are around a lot of these parks. Getting over to Europe would be a dream. And it's hard to think about travel plans. So we have a 2-year-old right now, and it's just like, I kick myself all the time that we didn't do more traveling and that I didn't do more traveling before becoming a parent, because there's this new constraint of like, where we can go, when we can go, and how long we can go while taking care of a kid. I think that figuring that out is a whole new challenge that I'm getting used to. But yeah, I would love to travel more. And I think as our kid gets older, it's definitely something that's going to become more of a priority for me.
And last question, I do appreciate, again, you taking the time to do this, especially because it's so early in the morning for you. One of the things I think is an interesting sort of psychological thing that I've noticed from talking to so many different photographers from so many different cultures and parts of the world and so on, is whether or not they kind of view themselves externally, whether they're looking at their work, their portfolio, the way that they present themselves as a photographer from an external point of view, or if they're just doing something in the way that feels right for them. And I find a lot of interest in the way people set out what I call their shop window, which is their website or their Instagram, the way that they display their work, the way they are self-referential. Personal favorite of mine is when people speak in like the third person. I always find that a really interesting sort of psychological trait. But if I was to ask you to kind of look at your work externally, how would you describe your style?
Oh, that's a tough one. I feel like I don't think about my work in that way often enough to have a good answer. I think that I photograph things that I find interesting. I photograph things that are meaningful to me. Yeah, I feel like I don't have a great answer to that. I feel like people viewing my work are going to see someone who's interested in buildings, interested in color, interested in form, interested in history. But yeah, that is definitely, that's a hard question.
I do like to ask at least one incredibly frustrating broad question. I'll tell you what, I won't finish with that one.
Okay.
Because that feels like that would be a bit mean of me. What's your aim going forward? Obviously, you've talked about photographing people, but are you looking to tighten up the work that you've already got and sort of whittle down your portfolio with regards to the building work and then integrate the portrait work into it? Or is that something that you're planning to keep separate and continue to grow both portfolios sort of separately?
No, that's not something I'm interested in separating out. And I do always find that interesting that some photographers do feel a need to do that, where they'll have 1, 2, 3 Instagram accounts where they keep different styles of work separate. I don't think there's anything wrong with it by any means. But personally, I think that I want the body of work to feel cohesive, even if the subject matter is not, if that makes sense. And kind of what I really would like to do as far as, portfolio and what the body of work looks like is Instagram is fun. Instagram is, I enjoy it. It's neat, but I want to really focus on printing work and being more selective with what I share, as far as printed stuff goes. Because I feel like Instagram, I don't take too seriously. I'll post, photos that I don't think are super great, that are just, interesting. But I think that when you really get down and start to edit yourself and choose what is going to be shown together, is where you can really showcase what your viewpoint as a photographer is. And that's something that I look forward to doing in the future.
Do you find that to be quite an interesting pattern? Because when you think about it, I've spoken to quite a few people that shoot film in the sense that there's the financial restriction that makes you really have to mean something with every shot. You have to be very considered and slow and very particular in the way that you take the photos because of the cost of the film and the developing and so on. And then to add to that further with the cost of the printing, do you feel like it's an interesting, I don't want to use the term, but I can't really think of a better way of putting it, but it's a bit of a gun to the head in the sense of it's like the financial restriction is what photographers seem to use to actually enforce some discipline on themselves in a sense.
Yeah, I definitely think that's the case. I also think, and this is just me personally, I think it's also why sometimes I'm sharing images to my Instagram, which I don't take too seriously, where it's like, it's not something that if I were choosing images for some sort of show that I would select, but it's like, hey, I paid to buy the film, take the photo, print the film. It's not a terrible photo. I'll put it on Instagram. So I think that, it slows you down when you're making these things, but also it might make you, not really edit yourself as much as I think that you should if you are trying to put together some sort of portfolio or some sort of show or a book or a zine. And so, that's how I view it. At least that's how I've experienced it since starting back up.
Do you feel like that kind of shows, I don't want this to sound negative, but do you think it kind of shows that photographers in general have a bit of an undisciplined nature in the sense that like when you take away the financial restrictions, they're kind of much looser with what they're presenting compared to if they had to put their money on it?
Yeah, I don't think that sounds negative at all. I think that that is the case. I think that that's something that if people are being honest with themselves, or if people are really, thinking about what they're doing, that is the case. That there is, I think that there's a lot of really talented people, and where the weakness is not having that discipline. And I don't think that I'm separate from that at all. I'm not trying to say that I'm not one of those people, but it's like that discipline with choosing what you take photos of, and then also choosing what you are sharing and what you are posting and what you're printing. I think that's kind of the next step. And I think that, by and large, not as many people consider that or think about that. And again, I don't think that I'm excluded from that by any means.
It's been obviously a really generous thing for you to take the time to do this. But the most important thing with the podcast is that I'm trying to share as much work that I love as possible. And the way that we do that is at the end of the podcast, we tell people where they can go to see all of the wonderful work that you do. So where's the best places for people to go to find your work?
So as of right now, Instagram only. I'm at Benjamin Dobbin, which is Dobbin. I'm working on setting up a website, and I think that that's where I want to be a little bit more of a curator with what gets shared. So I'm sure once that happens, I'll share it on Instagram. But yeah, for now, just Instagram.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. It's been really, really, really interesting. Thank you.
Hey, I really appreciate it. It was great talking with you.